It's the Hogstye.
Welcome back to the Hogstye. We're very pleased to have you. Today's a very special episode. We're going to tackle the name change issue. Now, our intention here is to be as unbiased as possible and represent all sides of this debate. Obviously, this is a sensitive topic, and we're bound to offend someone just by talking about it. But it's still worth doing, as the truth is not so clear-cut as either side likes to say it is. So our intention here is to start with a quick historical once-over for the term, talk about the history of the legal battle, and then debate whether the term is offensive. All right, so before we get into the history, my name is Sean Conti. I'm joined here today by the Hogs themselves, Alex Zeese.
Hey.
Steve Thomas.
Hello, everyone.
And Kelly Worrell.
Hi, everybody.
Now, history rise. The origin of the term Redskin dates back several centuries. Some of the earliest written appearances of the word are in letters and speeches from the late 1700s. Even name change proponents accept that the word had benign origins, a fact elucidated by a Smithsonian Institute language scholar's exhaustive research on the topic. The written evidence suggests that in its earliest forms, the use of the word Redskin was entirely acceptable, unoffensive, and common. It was used diplomatically between Native Americans and white settlers, and as a self-identifier among the Native American tribes themselves, in recorded talks dating back as early as 1769. Later, in the mid-1800s, a Choctaw Indian chief named Allen Wright named his home state Oklahoma, which literally translates to Red People, a name he chose to honor the high Native population, and one that remains to this day. But name change proponents are quick to point out that not all historical uses of the name are positive. In an 1863 edition of the Daily Republican, for example, one can find this quote: "The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every Redskin sent to purgatory. This sum is more than the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River are worth." Now, it's important to note that despite the claim that a Redskin itself is a bloody Indian scalp, there's no evidence for this. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the word became even more common. It can be found in James Fenimore Cooper's The Pioneers and Last of the Mohicans, both books sympathetic to Native Americans. But it also appears in Redskin Rhymes, an incredibly racist book of poetry written by Earl Emmons in 1915. Just 14 years after this, the word pops up again in the first Technicolor film ever made, 1929's Redskin. This film follows a Native American protagonist as he is harassed for his race and is considered to be far ahead of its time in terms of its understanding of Native American plight. Now, the word pops up a handful of other times in Hollywood movies and TV shows, including Northwest Passage and The Lone Ranger, typically in a not as positive, somewhat tongue-in-cheek manner, right up until about the 1960s, at which point the word really disappears from the American lexicon completely, except for its use in sport teams. Today, the word Redskin is still used as the name of the Washington football team. It's also used at the high school level in about 70 schools around the country, including at Red Mesa High, an entirely Native American high school on a reservation just miles from Amanda Blackhorse's home. Now, with such variety in its historical and contemporary use, it's no surprise that the term Redskin has generated controversy. Before we get into our opinions on that, Steve, can you take us through the legal history of this battle?
From a legal standpoint, there have been a few complaints here and there for decades, but the legal battle itself really started in 1992. A woman named Susan Harjo and a handful of other folks filed a complaint with the Patent and Trademark Office to get the trademarks for the name and the symbol, the registrations for the name and the symbol canceled by the Patent and Trademark Office. The Patent and Trademark Office actually agreed with them. It ended up in federal court. It bounced around for many years, and finally, at the end of it all, the federal district court found that there was insufficient evidence of disparagement against Native Americans, and also said that the plaintiffs were barred by a legal concept called laches, and what laches basically means is that they waited too long to bring the complaint. It did go to a federal appellate court. The federal appellate court did not reach the issue of disparagement itself. The federal appellate court poured the plaintiffs out of court solely on the basis of laches. Appellate courts have a history of reaching decisions based on as little issues as possible. They don't want to expand the law more than they have to. And so typically if there's a way to dismiss a case or reject an appeal based on some procedural thing like latches, they're usually going to do that, and that's what happened. That was 2009. Right before that, a couple years earlier, in 2006, Amanda Blackhorse and another small group of Native Americans filed another lawsuit alleging the same issues. Now, Blackhorse and the other plaintiffs are younger and young enough to defeat the latches argument, meaning that they're not so old that a court can say you waited way too long to argue about the trademarks. So that for this current lawsuit, that is not an issue. In the current lawsuit, the Patent and Trademark Office, at the administrative complaint filed originally, the Patent and Trademark Office did cancel the Redskins trademark registrations for the name and the symbol. The matter went to the Internal Administrative Appeals Board at the Patent and Trademark Office. That body issued a very long opinion about a year ago in June of 2014, which categorically supported the Native American position, upheld the cancellation of the trademarks for the name and the symbol. After that happened, the Redskins filed a lawsuit in federal court in Northern Virginia, and I talked about this last week. That judge sided for the Native Americans and held that a substantial composite of Native Americans believe that the name Redskins may disparage Native Americans. The team had argued about the First Amendment, said this is a First Amendment issue, and I'm going to get to that in a second. The court rejected the First Amendment claim. The Redskins said that there was a due process issue involved here because they were being deprived of property by losing the trademark registration. The court rejected that as well. That is also another very long 70-page opinion. For the Redskins, the next step is the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appellate court. As I said last week, this is historically known as an extremely conservative appellate court, probably second only to the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas and Louisiana in the country in terms of conservatism. In recent years, with the Obama administration having appointed a bunch of judges, that appellate court, the Fourth Circuit, has become much more balanced in terms of conservative versus liberal judges. So I think it's more of a crapshoot than anybody realizes in terms of what's going to happen next. After the appellate court opinion comes out, it is highly likely that the losing side will file a writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court to ask the Supreme Court to look at the issue. That is probably 2 to 3 years down the road. The two substantive legal issues here is a First Amendment issue, number one. Let me back up. The legal issue has to do with federal protection of trademarks, registration with the federal government. What this is not about is whether the team, the Washington football team, can use the name Redskins and the symbols. It is simply a matter of whether or not their use of those marks will be protected under federal law. The Redskins, the franchise will still have the protections of state law and will still have the protections of what's known as common law. And so it will be protected to a certain extent. Now, that's obviously not the agenda of the Native Americans. They want it stopped. We're going to talk about that. The First Amendment issue is this. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibits any law that abridges the freedom of speech. Now that's a few number of words to generate mountains and mountains and mountains of litigation over 200 years. The gist of it is that the Supreme Court has held consistently for a couple centuries now that a person does not have an unfettered right to say whatever they want just because of the First Amendment. The classic example, if you go to law school, this is from a case, the court talked about the fact that you can't walk into a crowded theater and yell fire just to entertain yourself, or just because you say it's your right to free speech, because that will endanger lives. It may cause a riot. People get hurt. So in that respect, a First Amendment right is limited out of the need to protect the public. Another area, for example, the court has said you can regulate vulgar speech. this bleeds out into the FCC. The FCC controls the use of, for example, the 7 dirty words on network television. That is an infringement upon freedom of speech for purpose of protecting the public. And so there are limits to the freedom of speech. Now, in this case, the issue with the Redskins is an issue of government speech versus private speech. The Redskins have said, the franchise, the Washington football franchise, has said we have the right to freedom of speech, and taking away our trademarks is an infringement upon our First Amendment rights. The district court held that this is not an infringement on private First Amendment rights. It is an infringement upon, it is government speech. It is the government regulating itself, which is not the same as limiting the Redskins' right to freedom of speech. Personally, I think that is a pretty strong argument. I don't think the Redskins are going to win on that in the end, because there's a Supreme Court opinion that came out about a month ago that was some plaintiffs in Texas wanted a Confederate flag license plate. The state refused to issue it. They sued the state, claiming their First Amendment rights were violated, and the Supreme Court held exactly what I just said it's government speech, not private speech. The government doesn't have to advocate anything, and you can still put a Confederate flag on your car if you want to. It just can't be on a license plate.
Right. Well, license plates are government property.
Well, it's not government property,
like
but it's a sanctioning. It is a government issued
right
plate, and so it's would be the government implicitly sanctioning what's on the plate. And the Supreme Court said that the government doesn't have to sanction something just because you want it there. That's the concept of government speech versus private speech. So that, real quickly, is the First Amendment issue here. I think the Redskins are going to lose on that, probably. The other issue is due process. The Lanham Act is the federal law that controls trademarks, and I'm not going to go into all of it. The relevant part is that the Lanham Act says that the government can cancel trademarks or reject or refuse to issue trademarks if the requested trademark may disparage a group of people. And so all of this stuff in all these cases all has to do with whether or not the trademarks may disparage Native Americans. And it's the standard is a substantial composite, meaning a substantial composite of people believe that the mark may disparage. As I said last week, and I'm going to wrap this up here. I don't want to get too into this. Don't worry, folks. But the federal court in Virginia, who issued their opinion a couple weeks ago, found that a substantial composite of Native Americans, may believe that their marks may disparage. The substantial composite is not a legal term otherwise used. It's not defined. It's kind of vague. The Redskins did argue that whole passage of the Lanham Act is unconstitutionally vague, and the court rejected that. I think that's a better argument probably for the Redskins, but it's also a tough hill to climb for them because there's lots of appellate court opinions on this. So that is a very brief, not that brief, that's a brief overview of the legal issue here. Anybody have any questions about that?
Well, I'm glad you got that in less than the 25 minutes you originally
How long
wanted.
did I go? 10? About 10 minutes? Okay.
About 10.
See, that's better. I could have done an hour. I could have droned on and on forever if you guys want. We can talk about 400 pages of legal opinions if you want.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, no. I think this is a great segue because the history of the legal battle is great for the context, but I think the purposes of our conversation today, we're really going to get at opinions here. And regardless of what's happened in the courts, I think we want to get at what our opinions are and whether or not Redskin really is an offensive term and whether or not the team name should change because of that. So, with that in mind, let's just get our opinions out there right up front. Now that we've heard the history of the term and the history of the legal battle, what do you think? Steve, is the word Redskin an offensive word?
Heck no. And the reason I say that is just from a personal standpoint, forget the legal arguments. I am not one to get offended easily by much. I think people need to kind of get over things and move on. Words are words. I don't think what happened 100 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago is all that relevant to what is happening in the future. So I'm not one to get offended by a lot. And just from a brief overview standpoint, I don't find it offensive.
Okay. And Kelly, what about you? Is the word Redskin an offensive term?
Well, there isn't any clear answer to that, right? I'm not personally offended by it, so is it an offensive term to me? No, because I don't get offended when I hear that word. That probably has something to do with the fact that I guess like many Americans, I have a little bit of native blood in me, but not enough. I wasn't raised on a reservation. I've been to a powwow, but it was as a guest. It wasn't as a family affair sort of thing. So, no, I'm not offended by the word Redskins. Is the word Redskin an offensive term? It seems to offend a fair number of people, so I think you have to say that it has the ability to be an offensive word, depending on who you are and what your experience is.
And Kelly, I want to come right back to that because I think that's a great point, but I want to ask Alex first, his opinion as well. Is the word Redskin an offensive term, Alex, to you?
Well, the word itself, I'm kind of with Kelly. I don't know because I've never been called it as a slur. I've been called plenty of slurs in my life.
I bet.
Being, half Jewish, being a white guy who lives in a...
Sure.
I'm the only white guy in about a mile radius of my part of D.C.
Sure.
I've been called plenty of insults and slurs in my lifetime. But, I have absolutely no Native American blood in me, so I've never been called that one. But at the same time, I have heard from enough people who live out in Arizona and who live out where there are large Native American populations that it is used at times as a slight or a slur for Native Americans. So
Sure.
I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt that you're not going to just outright make up that story to, make your point in a debate.
So this is another great point. So I want to come back to that. So Kelly, one thing that you said was the term Redskin can be offensive to some people. And Steve, you alluded to a significant composite of people.
The word was substantial composite.
Substantial composite of people. So as I mentioned as well in the historical thing that we did at the beginning, there are some Native American schools on reservations that use the term Redskin as the name for their sports teams. And ironically, Alex, you also mentioned Arizona. In Arizona, there's a school called Red Mesa High School. It's just a few miles from where Amanda Blackhorse lives, and Amanda Blackhorse, again, is one of the primary litigants in this patent and trademark case. And it uses the name Redskins for its sports team and mascot. In fact, the logo is very similar to the Washington Redskins logo. How do we feel about the fact that in some circles in the Native American community, the word Redskin is still alive in a positive sense? Kelly, what do you think about that?
I think that there are situations where cultures within their culture use terminology that they find to be empowering. In some ways, particularly when you're looking at a culture that has been, let's call it what it is, targeted for extermination by the government, throughout its history until, relatively recently. At some point they stopped having a policy of just killing Native Americans. They survived that, and that was a very, you have to say that's the biggest story in the history of the Native American story is they're being targeted for systematic extermination by Europeans and then by Americans. Because they survived that, and there are still pockets of Native Americans that exist and survive today, I can see them using terminology that they use amongst themselves as a badge of courage, as a word of pride. We were called this. They didn't get us all. We managed to find a way to survive, and we're proud of who we are. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're okay with other people calling us that. And so, and you see that in other cultures as well, right? The N-word being used in black culture. I have a number of Jewish friends who affectionately refer to each other with terms that I would never use to refer to them. And I sort of feel like it falls along those lines.
Really, really, really great points, Kelly. And I think, what you're talking about here is sort of cultural appropriation, and that's sort of one of the major aspects of this issue. It's this non-Native American entity, the Washington Redskin football team, using that likeness and using that word for themselves. So, again, what you're talking about, I think, is cultural appropriation. Now, Steve, as someone who doesn't think the word Redskin is offensive, what's your reaction to that aspect of the debate?
Well, I have always categorically rejected the idea that a group of people can consider a word offensive when used by others, but not when they use it themselves. I find that to be hypocritical and illogical. If a word is offensive, a word is offensive. And if the word is harmful, when used in every capacity and between every group. And so I completely reject the idea that it's okay that one group of people can use one slur between themselves, but no, you can't say it. Now, I don't want to use any words that offend anybody, mind you, but I don't find that to be a rational or logical argument at all.
And Kelly, do you have any reaction sort of to that? I mean, what is that?
Well,
how do you react to that?
All of us exist in society in different social groups, right? So, take the race equation out of it. I work in video games. I've worked in video games for about 20 years. There is a significant difference when my peers in the video game industry, many of whom are computer engineers and very technical people, when they refer to themselves as geeks and nerds, it means one thing. When you are in the high school getting slammed against a locker and getting called a geek and a nerd, it's a very different thing. So I think that there are times when you can use a term affectionately, and that same term used by somebody else can have a different connotation and a different impact on the person hearing it.
And Alex, do you have thoughts on this part of the debate specifically? You mentioned living in an area where you're representative of a much smaller racial demographic. I'm sure you hear language that wouldn't necessarily be okay for you to use.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And there have been times living in my neighborhood that I've been called the N-word, which is a little odd when you're a, pasty white guy to be called that.
Right.
But I want to get back to one thing Kelly said about appropriating what was once a slur for a team. And let's compare it to probably the biggest sports team in the United States, the New York Yankees. Now, if you don't know the basis of the name or the word Yankee, that was also a slur for many, many years. It was initially used by the Dutch against non-Dutch. I believe it was Dutch against non-Dutch in New York. And then it became kind of a reference for all of New England. Then the British used it as a slur against Americans from the French Indian War through World War II. Then, of course, you get to the Civil War, and it's Southerners using it to refer to Northerners, and it's still used as a slur to this day at that level. But it was kind of appropriated by a baseball team as, yeah, we're Yankees, and we're proud that we're Yankees, and, that's the history of it.
I want to interject real quick here, Alex, that the word Yankee as well, in an international sense, if you go to England, if you go to basically anywhere,
right.
If they detect an American accent, they'll call you a Yankee, whether you're from the North or the South. They don't care.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I've been called Yankee as a slur twice. Once was when I was in France, and once when I was working with a guy from Texas. He was from Dallas, and he kept on calling me Yankee all the time, and it was not meant as a compliment.
No.
The other thing I'd like to say is, I think what you said, Steve, about you don't want to use words that offend anyone. I think we all kind of, for the most part, most people agree with that. I kind of live my life by a simple policy of don't be a douche. And,
words to live by.
A good key to that is, just don't go out of your way to offend people if you don't have to.
Sure.
Yeah,
Steve, react.
Yeah, I mean, there's always kind of the 1% on both ends of the bell curve who are way out there and who are not going to subscribe to societal norms about all sorts of stuff, and that's not who we're talking about here. We're talking about the 99% of the people who are reasonable, normal people Not the kind that are going to blow up abortion clinics, because, they don't believe in that. And, not the type that are going to scream the N-word out there just to irritate people. That's not who we're talking
Generally
about.
speaking, my policy is if you're going to use violence to get your point across, you're out of
Yeah,
my
yeah.
discussion
And
group.
I've been called Yankee plenty of times, having traveled internationally with the military and all that. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, you're a northerner living in the South.
Yeah, because I'm in Texas, for everybody who knows, and I get called a Yankee on maybe a weekly basis by somebody. It doesn't bother me at all. I don't care. It's call me whatever you want. I'm just not that sensitive about it, and that's kind of where I shake out. Big picture on the Redskins name change. Look, I believe that you have to have some sort of historical basis for being offended by something. And other slurs, the N-words, clearly there's a hard and fast, undeniable historical basis for the use of the word that is awful, and it's, certainly the worst black mark on the history of the country. It represents death and awful things that we don't need to discuss.
Violence,
the word
all
Redskin
sorts
does
of
not
terrible
have
things.
anywhere near that. Even giving the other side of the debate the benefit of the doubt, the word Redskin does not have anywhere close to that usage of the word. The team clearly, means this as a compliment, not as an insult. They're trying to convey strength, power, fighting spirit, warrior spirit. It's not meant as an insult.
Yeah, sure. I want to address that. I also want to go back to something Alex said before with the Yankee thing. I think we have to be a little bit honest because white people, Northerners, European settlers, that's not necessarily what we think of in this country when we think of oppressed groups. So I think
No, we've had it pretty great.
We've
for
had
the
it pretty
last 10,000 years.
It's been pretty comfortable, So I think part of us saying, we're not offended by that is because Yankee, sure, it was meant to disrespect a demographic of people, but
Right.
it wasn't really done in the greater context of oppression that these other terms may have been. Now, I do want to bring
It was
up...
probably more along the lines of
I
yokel.
disagree with that, by the
Exactly.
way. I mean, the Civil War was fought between the North and the South, and the South
but-
used it as a term to reflect that the North was trying to oppress them, and they meant it as a distinct insult.
But here's the thing.
Sure.
The South lost, right? The South lost. They use it in a bitter sense. They don't
Yeah.
they're not they don't like Yankees, but it's not like there are groups of Southerners who have historically been going around targeting people and beating the crap out of them and yelling Yankee, Yankee, Yankee. The British use it in the same way. Stupid Yanks. Well, yeah, the British lost. The Americans won. The Yankees are 2-0 in major wars against people who refer to them as Yankees.
Right.
True. Right. Totally valid. Now, all of those things that you just mentioned, Kelly, in terms of people running around and crying this name and sort of more explicitly oppressing people, I want to talk about the word colored, because I think that the word colored, almost any criteria you could use to determine a term's offensiveness, and if you're going to compare Redskin to colored side by side, you're going to find, I think, in any objective criteria you could use that the word colored is worse. It's got a worse history. It was used explicitly in government-mandated and government-sponsored segregation. Water fountains, swimming pools, public schools, coloreds only, meaning blacks only. That was not endearing language. It was meant to disparage. It was meant to denigrate. It affects It affects a much larger population than the Native American population. Colored really, it could mean anybody. I mean, obviously it was primarily targeted at African Americans, but really, I mean, officially, it was any non-white person essentially in the United States at that time. The word Redskin has no history that compares to that. In fact, most of the history is very there's a lot of contradicting uses for the term. So I just think any way that you could compare those two terms, colored comes out worse, and yet it is still a trademarked term And it's, by the way, it's a dictionary-defined racial slur, colored. It's still a trademark term in this country, obviously used by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So I just wanted to put that out there and get your reactions to those two words.
Sure. So Steve and I are old enough to remember a time when, and I guess right now there's still some debate about whether the appropriate term is black people or African American people. It certainly is not colored people. However,
Correct.
when I was little, it was the question was, do you use colored people? Negro is not the right word to use.
Right.
Nigger is never the right word to use. You can't use that word, and there's very good reason for it. But colored, when they were saying colored drinking fountains, colored this, colored that, it was a less offensive term than the other terms that were being thrown around at the time. It was considered an okay word. Maybe not the greatest of all words, but that nobody had the term African American back then. It just didn't exist.
No. There was Afro-American in the 70s,
There was
wasn't
Afro-American in the 70s, and colored was an accepted term for a time. One of the reasons why we don't hear the word redskin in that kind of regard is because there are hardly any left. There are very few contexts in which you would discuss Native American people because they're a very small group of people who are very isolated. Largely, they have reservations that they were put on and forced to stay on and kept out of society for generation upon generation. So it's hard. It's hard to hear that. Well, we just don't use the word, and the reason we don't use the word is because they're gone. Black people were never systematically exterminated and they were enslaved, but they weren't put to death in the numbers and percentages that the native people were, and so it's we can say that we don't hear it very often, and it's very sad the reason why we don't.
Okay. First of all, the reason the NAACP still has its trademark, despite the use of the word colored people, is that nobody's challenged the trademark. Okay. If the trademark was challenged, it is the exact and precise same issue, only worse, because of the documented negative history of the use of the word colored going all the way back to the Civil War era. I think from a legal standpoint, it is precisely in exactly the same situation, only worse. Number one.
Well, the difference being that the NAACP is an association of black people.
It matters not a single bit. Let me give my chance, Kelly. It matters not a bit because
not
it doesn't.
Legally.
No, it does not matter because if a group of people decide they are offended by the word, they have the same precise argument. Okay, it doesn't matter what the point. The Redskins have a Native American charity. It's what is it, the Washington Redskins Original Americans Foundation?
Americans Foundation.
Yep. I mean, I don't know if they've trademarked that name or not. Probably not. But that is an organization designed to help that very group of people. It's the same precise argument. I'm just telling you, it doesn't matter the purpose of the organization. It matters that the people to whom it is the name is referring are offended or not, and whether they can prove that the name colored people may disparage or not. It's exactly the same issue. Exactly.
See, I don't see it as exactly the same, because part of what we're talking about is consent. Part of what we're talking about is whether the Washington Redskins is not a Native American organization, and the NAACP is an organization by and for minorities, and to me that's a very large difference.
Did every minority vote for the use of the word colored people?
Doubt it. No.
Of course not. Some small group of people who started the organization decided that was the name, and that's fine to them. The entire population, I would, you could argue. I can guarantee you, I could find a substantial composite of African Americans in this country that, in a vacuum, would take great offense to being referred to as colored people. I can
Yes.
guarantee you that's the case. The issue is simply that the case hasn't been filed. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I just wanted to throw this out there. So back in, I think it was 2009, president of the NAACP, I believe his name was Reverend Baker, I want to say, at the time. I hope I didn't butcher that.
What's his name now?
Is his name still the president? Okay. Well, he was asked in an interview in 2009 by just some guy, a Wake Forest resident. He said, this is something that I'm confused about. So if the word colored is offensive, why is it still used in the NAACP's name? And Mr. Baker's response was pretty telling. He said, good question. It is offensive. So he sort of acknowledges right up front that it is an offensive term. And he says, well, one of the reasons that we don't change it is out of respect for our history and our founders. I think that's sort of an interesting, it's interesting to think that a perceived, that, your history can trump a perceived moral obligation to change what is a racial slur. So I just want to throw that out there. I think that's an interesting train of thought for him to use. I also, I just wanted to say, too, that it doesn't matter to me. I'm kind of with Steve on this. It doesn't matter to me if you're a part of a certain demographic group. I think if a term is offensive for one person to use, it should be considered offensive, and if you're calling the word Redskin offensive, I don't see how you could say colored is not.
Hey, Alex, you're the only one here that can be as far as I believe, that can be categorized as being in an ethnic minority. Here, you're Jewish. Are there Jewish?
I mean, I'm not a practicing Jew.
But that's your ethnic background. Are there words that you and your family and/or friends and/or I don't know if you belong to any Jewish groups or not. Are there words that you use between yourself that would be considered offensive if used by the public?
Well, okay, so the obvious worst one for Jews would be kike, and no, Jews don't call each other that. The closest I could say is maybe a little bit of Yiddish here and there, and even then, it's more out of jest at this point. My grandparents' generation, the ones that actually knew Yiddish, they would probably use things like schmuck and things like that all the time about other Jews. But again, that's not an ethnic slur. That's just using another language to insult
I
somebody.
call people schmuck all the time, all sorts of different races.
I can tell you from very, very, very personal experience that there are words that are used frequently amongst each other in the LGBT community that are totally not okay when hurled at them by angry straight people.
The F word, I assume, is what you're talking about?
Well, no, tranny. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
There are all kinds of words that people refer to affectionately. If you look at the drag queen community alone, they will say horrible things to each other. But there is an underlying respect that is understood and has been established, and it's a safe place, and they know that it's a safe place, and that's very different than hearing those words out in public from people.
I mean, I have plenty of friends in the gay community, and they do definitely use the F word particularly liberally.
You see, I don't think that's okay. If a group wants society to respect it and to treat that group, whether it's gay people, whether it's homosexual people, whether it's LGBT, well, whatever group it is, if you want society to respect your group more, you need to stop using the very slurs that you claim society is using improperly. I strongly believe
that's a valid point. That's a very valid point. At the same time, I don't know if you've ever been a part of an oppressed minority group.
No, I can tell you, I'm a white guy, white male, European descent.
Right.
I have a tiny bit of Native American blood in me. I don't claim that as an ethnic background. So no, I'm not. No.
So when you are a part of a group that is targeted for violence by the majority, you find ways to empower yourself. You find areas of strength, and so it's a courageous act for people who have been, physically beaten, have had friends killed, have had people commit suicide. These things that happen when you're part of a minority who is oppressed by the majority. you have to look for ways to find strength and empower yourself and carry on. And one of the ways to do that is to call yourself the very names that are being hurled at you by other people. It's a way of showing each other these words can't hurt us, right? We're not going to get hurt by words. We're going to take that and take it as a source of pride. And that's a tough thing to understand, but it's a very real thing that happens.
I just disagree with that strongly. I think we have just a disagreement with that. If it's not okay, it's not okay, period. That's the way I look at it. I cut you off, Sean. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, so tell me this, Kelly. In response to what you just said, do you think when you hear about these Native American schools on reservations that are using the term Redskin, do you think that they're, quote unquote, taking it back? Or is it really just that it's a term that to them means pride? It's not offensive. I don't think that by naming their sports teams it's a method of reappropriating a word that was used against you. I think it's really like, this is a term of pride for us. We're going to call our sports team this.
It can be both, and I think it is both. I think that you are taking back a term that was used in a negative context, that was used to hurt you and your people, and at the same time, that's what makes it a word of pride, is the fact that this is how we're going to identify ourselves, and we're going to use this word, and in doing so, we're taking pride amongst ourselves. Now, if somebody else uses that word, it is a different thing, and I can see where it would be nice if language meant the same things to the same, to everybody, no matter who it came from and who it was directed at. But that's just not that's not the everyday reality of being called things.
Kelly, I think you are imposing a viewpoint on the use of the word Redskins based on your experiences, your beliefs of racial slurs in other contexts. And the reason I say that is, it is an historical fact. Again, if you go back to the use of the N-word, the use of the Jewish slur you mentioned, Alex, all those have a very strong history of those words in particular being used associated with violence. There's terms that the Nazis used against the Jewish people in World War II, for example. It's associated with 6 million Jewish deaths. The use of the N-word was used by slave owners when they were beating and killing their slaves and abusing them. There is not the same history of the use of that word by white Americans or by any Americans against Native American people. And there's no doubt that Americans treated the Native American people horribly. We killed a bunch of them and we put them on reservations. My ancestors were a part of that. But I don't think it's a case of Native American people on reservations taking back an evil slur. It appears to me that it's solely that they like the term and it's used associated with from a position of strength. It is not, to me, the same thing as the N-word, for example.
Okay, well, one thing I will say about that is I kind of got to disagree to a point about the history of why people get offended. There was one of the articles we kind of looked at when we were doing some of the historical research had a very kind of eloquent way of putting this. Okay, the word itself wasn't just used, like you didn't just go and shout Redskin and that was that. It was usually used in a context of, like the piece Sean read, where we want to pay $200 per dead Redskin. It was used frequently. It was the word du jour used during Western expansion when we would frequently be going about the genocide of the Native American people. So that's what they're upset about. It's that this was the word everyone called us at our worst moment in history.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, let me read that quote again because I think you're making an interesting point.
I paraphrased it. I didn't have it in front of me.
So the quote was, "The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every Redskin sent to purgatory. This sum is more than the dead bodies of all Indians east of the Red River are worth." So that's offensive. That's an offensive quote. There's no two ways about it. I do want to point out, though, that you could easily say the state reward is increased to $200 for every dead white man sent to purgatory. It's not, white man is not an offensive term. It's
No.
the context of what's being said, the message behind what's being said is offensive, but the fact that they just use the term Redskin doesn't necessarily mean that Redskin
But-
itself is offensive there. It's
My
just
point.
Go ahead.
My point is that, yeah, it's not the offending words, but it was used enough times in that same context that people feel like it then takes on that context itself.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there is an academic study that was written about this. I think we all have read it, but the public out there may not know about it. This is from the Native American Studies Journal, Volume 19, Issue 2 from 2005. Ives Goddard wrote an article called "I Am a Redskin, the Adoption of a Native American Expression, 1769 and 1826." And to kind of paraphrase it in couple sentences, what he does is he documents the history, the first history of the use of the word Redskin. And what it boils down to is that it first appeared in speeches by Native American leaders in the late 1600s, and then it expanded there into, it was from white American translations of Native American speeches, and then it was the James Fenimore Cooper novels that were the first documented use in the public and in published form of the use of the word Redskin, and the theme throughout. And his article stops the documentation in the 1800s. It's not a modern look at it.
Yeah,
but
well, early
1820,
1800s,
I think.
1826 is an interesting thing to pick out because you're talking about pre-Manifest Destiny at that
Right.
point.
Yep.
And what Manifest Destiny usually is kind of coincides with what we're talking about with the Trail
Yeah.
of Tears and most of the genocide.
Yeah, and it's 1826. That's in the title of the article, by the way. It's when he stops. But throughout, up until that period, he doesn't document any use as a racial slur, really, and he documents.
I agree with you there that in
Yeah.
the early periods it was completely benign.
Right.
There is
And I agree that the team does not use it with an intent as a slur either, by the way.
there's no doubt in my mind that the Washington Redskins means the word, that the intent is to present a brave, strong warrior type of Native American. This is a common sort of imagery to use in athletic teams. Let's put the fighter,
particularly football, because Native Americans had a very important impact on the early years of the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jim Thorpe.
Absolutely. Jim Thorpe. Dartmouth had a very strong team for a very long time.
The whole Carlisle Indian School. Yeah.
Absolutely, right. So we're not going to, solve here whether the word is offensive or not. There is disagreement, widespread disagreement amongst Native American groups as to whether or not the word is offensive, should be considered offensive. You ask, one Native American person, they'll give you one answer. We have a saying in Quaker circles: if you ask 10 Quakers what the definition of God is, you'll get 15 answers. And it seems about the same way when you ask Native Americans about the word Redskin. You're going to have a variety of opinions, and I think that that's fair. But I have a hard time seeing a scenario where we have to come up with some sort of a calculation to determine how many people is enough people to be offended for it to be considered offensive. That's a very difficult sociological question.
Yeah, well, blame federal law for that, and blame the Supreme, the court system for trying to interpret what substantial composite means. That term, substantial composite, is one thing that the legal community will call an objective standard, but it really isn't very objective at all. It's not, it's not objective in that you can count. The law doesn't say if 100 people, say something's offensive, then it's offensive. It's what I would refer to as a subjectively objective standard. So for lack of a better term.
I like that.
Yeah. I totally lost my train of thought on this. Oh yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. The point I wanted to make is just so people know, is that the symbol on the Redskins helmet, which is the head of the Native American guy.
Yeah, the logo.
It was in fact developed with the cooperation of Native Americans. It was drawn and created by a Native American who came to the team in, I think, the early 70s, I believe, and said, "Look, if you're gonna have the Redskins as your mascot, let's have a realistic looking mascot." And so that is why it was drawn.
He was Blackfoot, right?
I'll take your word for it. I can't remember. Was he a Blackfoot?
Yeah.
Okay. This is in distinct contrast to something like Chief Wahoo, from the Cleveland Indians, which is very much a caricature. And there can be no debate that is used as anything but a caricature for purposes of, Wahoo obviously is sort of a cheer.
It's a Sambo is what it is.
Yeah, exactly right. That is distinctly different from the symbol that the Redskins use today on their helmets.
Yeah, there's no question in my mind that the Washington Redskins intends to honor Native Americans.
Very important difference, though.
Well, they intend to honor Native Americans, but at the same time, the other side of that coin is the stubborn refusal to consider listening to Native Americans when it comes to this. When you say things like "they will never," and you can put that in all caps, change the name. That's just petulant. There's no real other way to describe that. When I'm not going to do it ever, never, never, never. That's a 4-year-old throwing a tantrum.
It's Dan Snyder's right, though. It's his team. It's
right
a private
to
business.
It's
his right to do it. It's his team. He owns it. It's a private business. He can call it whatever he wants.
His right.
Well, it's always going to be his right, Kelly. I mean, he may lose trademark protection. If the worst case scenario happens for him, he's going to lose all protections of the name. But he doesn't have to change the name of his business ever. He doesn't. It's a private business.
The NFL will probably force him to.
Yeah, but that's business pressure. I'm saying from a legal standpoint,
he could still keep the name.
Well, they can't really kick him out. They can't force him to sell. They could remove him from governance of the NFL, maybe. If you want me to do a hour-long briefing on the CBA, I can do that. Just volunteering myself.
Well, no, I would kind of love to get into maybe a different episode. What happened with Donald Sterling and how he kind of just got forced out of the NBA.
Marge Schott with the Reds, same issue.
Yeah. Does the NFL have that kind of thing? But
I don't want to address that now. I'm not really ready to talk about that in any kind of detail. But point is, he doesn't ever have to change the name of the football team ever if he doesn't want to.
No, he doesn't. But he could talk about it like an adult, or he could talk about it like a stubborn 4-year-old.
Well, he hasn't really talked about it much at all, personally, to the media. It's the team reacting.
The team's talked about it through mouthpieces.
Yeah, I don't know if he's ever been interviewed that I remember in the media where somebody said, "What about the name?" Maybe he has. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I don't remember Daniel Snyder personally expressing that opinion. What I remember is it always coming from the team via its reaction to the lawsuits, via the mouthpieces and Tony Wiley or whatever else may be. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the quote Kelly gave was Dan Snyder directly talking about, and it had to do with the lawsuit. But
it was in that letter, wasn't it?
Quote,
you're right.
No,
Did he write a letter about it?
He was talking to the USA Today
or somebody.
He said the quote is, "We will never change the name of the team. As a lifelong Redskins fan, and I think that the Redskins fans understand the great tradition and what it's all about and what it means. So we feel pretty fortunate just to be working on next season. We will never change the name. It's that simple. Never. You can use caps."
And that's a very
so that was him talking about it directly.
A point needs to be made that the name is almost 80 years old now. There is
83.
There is in fact a long tradition of use of the name with this franchise, and I think that has value. And there's 80 years of the team attempting to honor Native Americans through use of the name.
Now we could also talk about that history a little bit too. I mean, let's. I don't know who would be listening to this that doesn't know this. The team was originally the Boston Braves.
Right.
And the reason they changed the name to Redskins, there's a lot of debate back and forth, but somebody posted an article or found an article recently interviewing George Preston Marshall about changing the name. And it wasn't necessarily about glorifying Native Americans or anything like that. He really just wanted something that he had to change it from Braves to something, and it made sense because he found they had red uniforms, they were going to the Red Sox stadium. It all kind of just coalesced together. we have the whole story of, the head coach was one of the Carlisle Indian School guys. There's some debate about whether he was a Native American or not. I think both sides kind
Lone
of
Star Beats.
take that to an extreme.
Well, and let's just get this out there that,
Yeah.
George Preston Marshall, I think everybody who's listening who's a Redskin fan knows this, but George Preston Marshall was an open and avowed racist. He was the last,
Sure.
he was, the Redskins were the last team to integrate specifically because he held prejudice against African Americans. I mean, let's just throw that out there
Now,
so
but
the
he was
public knows that.
But
Sure.
let's also be clear. He was racist against African Americans. They had 4 Native American players on the team early on.
Right.
Yes. So
Right. His
one of the
racism may
things
have
that's-
been limited to African Americans, perhaps.
Yeah,
Maybe,
he,
who knows?
He
Right,
had some
maybe.
things he said
Some racists are
about
very
Jews
selective.
that they weren't.
Well, yeah, he might have
Yeah.
disliked other people. I don't know, but the only evidence of his hatred came against African Americans. Is my point.
Right.
Right.
Kelly,
One of the things that I think is important to recognize, though, is that the United States in 1933 and the United States in 2015 are two very different places.
Oh, yeah.
Totally.
We've been through a lot as a country, and one of the trends that I think you can see as you go forward through time is that we're talking about we're talking about society changing in a way where the scope of people who are deemed to deserve respect and equality has steadily increased since the start of the nation. It's only gone one direction, right? We every here and again things like Jim Crow laws come, we take steps backward, but by and large the march of history throughout not just the United States but the world moves into this direction where we treat people equally and we determine that everybody, no matter, you're seeing it with Aboriginal Australians, they now have rights that they didn't have for a long time because they just weren't deemed worthy of having rights. And we have that history here in America with black people, with Native Americans, with women, with all kinds of groups. That's only going to continue to go forward. And as it goes forward, smaller and smaller groups of people begin to have their voices heard and their rights respected. I think that once if the Native American people, who are facing, by the way, all kinds of other problems, this is not a huge problem for Native Americans, right?
Yeah.
They face poverty, rampant alcoholism, lack of education, lack of resources. All of these, they have a lot of issues to deal with. They, by and large, don't give a fuck about does the name change? This is not our big problem.
Right.
But.
And those other problems.
Well, but I think, though,
yeah.
just to finish up, I think that if they were to come together to decide this is an issue that we care about, eventually it's going to change, in my opinion. I think that it would behoove the Redskins to be proactive about that and not take on a sort of stubborn, resistant attitude, but to take on a proactive attitude as other teams have done in the past.
Kelly, I am totally with you on what you said, and I think you hit on a couple of interesting things. First, sounds obvious, but the thing that stuck out to me was you made the point. 2015 is not 1930. It's not 1940.
No.
It's not even 1960. Things have changed a lot, and you're right. There has been this slow, steady, socially progressive movement that will continue on into the future. I could not agree more. Here's the thing, though. I think one of the things that happened is sitting here in 2015, we look back and we have applied cultural sensitivities to words that predate these issues. So we look at the word redskin and we think, okay, it's a color and then the word skin. It has to be racist. Of course it's racist. I mean, you would never, it just seems so racist to our 2015 minds. But if you think about the fact that the word originated in the 1700s in Native American communities that had no history or legacy of segregation or racism or integration, none of those things that have happened in those, or English, exactly.
Well,
those concepts of that being a racist kind of way to refer to someone didn't exist. So I think what we have done is we have looked backwards in time at antiquated terms, because that's what I think it comes down to. I think Redskin is antiquated. It's not offensive, it's antiquated. And we have applied our 2015 cultural sensibilities and neuroses and paranoias to those words. And I think that's what happens is we have racialized almost a word that, it wasn't used that way. It wasn't intended that way, but we've looked back and applied those meanings to it. That's what I think has happened.
Well, I think you have a fair point, but at the same time, history kind of sucked. I love history. I've studied history. If you were to list my interests, it's video production, history, Redskins, and then and politics, and that's pretty much it.
And women.
Women.
History up until World War II, if you were alive, your life probably sucked. So,
True.
Yeah, all these words you're talking about, they were not offensive at the time. People didn't use toilet paper either. We shouldn't go back to not using toilet paper,
Right.
Sean.
That's true.
So-
That's true.
Yeah, and as far as the March of Social Progress, we have to remember this is all relatively new. If you lived in the very first agricultural societies up until about the 1700s, your life was pretty much the same. No matter what, you were a farmer, and if you wanted to do anything else, you were screwed.
Yeah,
Things didn't change until democracy kind of happened in the United States. That's when, maybe we should start putting the best people in the positions that they can excel in, and that's where social progress really started.
Look, I think society has taken an absurd turn here. I think it's just crazy what people in today's world are focused on. Words and labels don't matter. What matters is what's happening in the country substantively, okay? What matters to Native American people to me is poverty, drug abuse, crime, education, all those things. And I think society in general spends so much time worrying about labels, worrying about little words. I think it's absolutely absurd. I think this is a case of political correctness run amok here. People in today's society love to worry about things that don't matter. And they do that because it makes good media stories. It makes people like the four of us on the Hogsty spend an hour and a half talking about it. It makes TV networks money, because it sounds salacious and, advertisers are going to spend money on it and people are going to watch it. But at the end of the day, it's just absurd. I really do. I think people are not focused on what is actually important with all this, worrying about labels and words. That's my opinion.
I think that you've hit on something that I wanted to mention, and this is kind of like my closing thought, kind of on the whole issue. We have a habit in society, I think, of focusing on the little issue at the expense of looking at the big one. This phenomenon occurs all over society. I think we're worried about the Redskin name while the N-word is alive and kicking, more alive than it's ever been. When the word colored is another trademarked phrase with the worst history. We've already mentioned those things. It pops up in other places too. We raise the most money in this country for breast cancer. The number one killer is heart disease. And it's not bad that you raise money for breast cancer, but at the same time, it's an example of going for a lesser evil in a way, or taking a step back from the big elephant in the room issue. We have a habit of doing that, and I think, ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, it went viral. What percentage of people suffer from ALS? Not many. You know what I mean? So it's great things that we do, but I think we have a habit of getting distracted.
Who could
and
even
ultimately,
define
I think
ALS?
Right. I mean, exactly. It's Lou Gehrig's disease. That's all I could tell you.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's great. We do good things, but we ignore sometimes the biggest goods that we could do. It seems crazy to me to hone in on the word Redskin when the N-word, again, it's the radio, in movies, on TV, on the street. You hear it everywhere. It's incredibly offensive, and the word lives on. So I think it's just interesting to think about that. Kelly, I know you're going to tell me I'm an idiot. So
Mostly
please
what I
continue.
wanted to say, Sean, is that you're an idiot. No, I'm teasing. You're not an idiot.
You're probably right.
You're not an idiot, Sean. But you do have your experience and your perspective and your history that your opinion is formed from, and that's true of everybody, right? Everybody comes to these. We have a lot of different kinds of sort of controversies or differences of opinion in America, and America is a special country, right? Because we were theoretically formed in the beginning largely, I guess we were formed by white people of different religious persuasions was the big sort of melting pot in the beginning, and then we've become a racial melting pot over the years, and we've become sort of in some ways a symbol for like an experiment of let's see what happens when we throw all the cultures together in one place and how does it pan out. And all I can say is that it's very difficult when you have been a part or are a part of a group of people who is an oppressed minority, and they do exist. Mm-hmm. So, you can't say there are no oppressed minorities because there are. And you've been targeted for violence, which I have. When you have been in those shoes, you can say that words do matter. If you have not had words thrown at you as a warning that you're about to get an ass kicking because of who you are, which is, and who you are is largely not your choice, right? You're different. I'm going to use these words to let you know that I've identified you as different, and what's coming next is going to be painful for you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Words do matter. And there is no way to convey that. And I'm not saying that the word Redskins is used that way on a regular basis. Sure. But I think it's important to note that language, while it seems like it shouldn't be as important because a word doesn't have a direct impact on a person, it's used as a way to let you know that you've been marked for violence, and that is very important.
First of all, I think words only matter if you let them matter. What matters is that the group was targeted for violence, not what the words that were the words that were called. That you were called. I think just generally, the word, the country would be better off if we all started talking about ourselves as Americans. I don't have a clue what my ethnic background is, really and truly. I know I'm white. I know my ancestors from Europe. I've heard I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I really couldn't care less.
Right.
I don't care a single bit, because to me, I'm an American, and that's the end of it. And I don't care really, other than just historical interest. I don't care where I came from, because I think of myself as an American first.
Well, why would you care, though? I mean, if it doesn't, I can see where it doesn't matter for.
I have Cherokee blood in me, Kelly.
Well, sure,
I have ancestors who were Cherokee.
Most of us do.
Yeah, I do, and I've talked to some of my family who has a generation older and therefore more Native American blood, and none of them care about this name thing. I called a family member the other day about this, and she said, I really couldn't care less what the name is. I don't care a single bit. There's so many other problems. It just doesn't matter. That was her quote to me about it.
If you were a black person, if you were born black, and your parents had been through the 60s and the 50s and had, and had been victimized by, whether it was political victimization or physical or whatever it might have been, then it might be harder for you to say it doesn't matter what your ancestry is. We're all Americans and we're all equal. If you were brought up in an environment where your safety as a child, you were taught that your safety and physical well-being hinges upon your ability to negotiate racial differences and race relations.
Yeah, but again, it's not the words that are being used. It's the fact that there are some Americans out there still to this day that don't like others because of the color of their skin. It has nothing to do with what they're calling them. Does anybody know who General Benjamin O. Davis is? Y'all heard of him? General Benjamin O. Davis was one of the founders and the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen Squadron in World War II. This is the Army Air Corps Squadron who was all African American, who flew P-51s. He had an outstanding combat record in World War II. He lived up until about 10 years ago or so. He was shunned at West Point. He was the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century. He was silenced for 4 years. He got through it. I saw him speak about 20 years ago, and one of the things he said, and just as a point, I think I was one of only a handful of white people in the crowd, which I thought was sad. It was primarily African American, and then me, which says something in and of itself. But
Right.
what he told the crowd, somebody asked him afterwards something to the effect of, something about racial slurs and racial names, and he said, "Look, I don't consider myself an African American. I consider myself an American." And what that is, that's his way of moving forward. I think by focusing on the words that were used in the past and caring about them, we make them matter. They only matter because people believe they matter. And they believe they matter because of what happened in the past to them. And if a certain group is, if people have been oppressed and the result is that, they're, poor and in crime-ridden, poor education, in the urban cities or whatnot, and there's minorities, certainly fewer white people and more minorities in those situations. Well,
Right.
let's figure out how to move forward and not focus on why you're there. As a society, that's more helpful. Figure out how to end it. Let's not worry about and get hung up on words that were used in the past.
Well, but
Move
there are
forward.
words that are being used in the present as well, right?
It's not
so
Redskins.
no, not Redskins, right? So just talking in general, and those words serve to remind you that there is still a hierarchical structure based on your race, based on your gender, based on your orientation. That there is still, you are still less than the straight white male Christian, right? So that's the top of the food chain, and there are words used to let other people know that they don't have the same privileges or the same safety as other people, and so those. I know that like a word is a sound, and that a sound doesn't have meaning in that context. It can't physically hurt you, but it reminds you of a social violence that continues to this day. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Eliminating the word doesn't fix the problem. It absolutely doesn't. But I think that there is value to if you curtail the use of the word, you are to some extent saying that you're not condoning the structure that exists. I probably didn't put that as clear as I could, but I hope that made sense.
I'm with you, though. I'm picking up what you're putting down there. I hear you there. I think the crazy thing about words is, or a counterintuitive way to think about it at least, is if you say, for example, that one person can use a word but another person cannot. I see where you're coming from. You're saying this demographic of people use this word against, my demographic in the past. They shouldn't be able to use it. I want to be able to use it to take it back, quote unquote. I just feel like part of what you're doing is you're actually being divisive. You're talking about things in terms of a them and an us. You're saying I can do this because I'm them, I'm us, and you can't do this because you're them. There's a line, and so you're actually drawing.
Yes.
You're keeping that line very clearly drawn instead of just saying, look, all racial slurs are racial slurs. Let's get rid of all of them. Let's not have any of them. The NAACP should get rid of that. The Redskins should get rid of that. Everything should go away.
The lines
equally.
do exist.
They do exist, but should they? Because I think, Steve, that's part of Steve's point, is maybe we should just move on together. Let's join hand in hand and move on together instead of looking at things through these very clearly defined past lines in the sand.
Stop being
once
so
it's-
sensitive.
Once
You can
it's
simplify
safe,
it like that.
once it's safe to do that, so let's say I'm a transgendered woman. If it's safe for me to go hang out at a NASCAR game, if it's safe for me to go to the bar and get a drink, if it's safe for me to do that, then by all means, let's pretend that the lines don't exist, or just drop them all together and say that they're not there and we're all one happy family. But that's not the reality.
But let's
Yeah,
focus,
no, I
but
hear-
you got to come back to the Redskins, though. That's not what Redskins is.
But it's part of the greater context.
Yeah,
of the
but the
conversation.
greater
I agree,
context.
I agree.
But that's what would happen to a transgendered woman, or an African American in 1960 in Birmingham, Alabama, or Montgomery, Alabama, is not what the name Redskins is about. It's not.
I agree with that, but I'm not speaking from the perspective of a person whose family felt the sting of that word. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that's tricky is what level of racism do Native Americans feel today? That's the real question,
right?
That I think kind of gets lost in this. Like right now, we know the KKK and the Black Panthers are fighting in a fist fight in South Carolina about the Confederate flag. But
maybe they'll beat each other up.
Time? Yeah, well, everyone's a winner in a way, right? What is the last major incident against Native Americans like that? That's kind of a question that I've been wondering with this whole debate.
It's a very valid question. From my research, there have been no real lawsuits filed against anyone for using the word Redskin ever. There's no civil cases. There's not a whole long legal trail of legal battles.
I can tell you there's not.
There's really none. And I think the issue, that is not, like we've sort of alluded to before, that is not the issue that the Native American community is suffering from.
Genocide
think about this.
is one of those things that sticks around.
Yeah, that's a long time ago. It had nothing to do with the word Redskins. Think about this.
Plus, we're all complicit in that at this point.
There's been millions of dollars spent on the 1992 Harjo complaint and lawsuit, and then the current Black Horse lawsuit. Millions of dollars in legal fees. I can guarantee. Even if the time is the people are taking the plaintiff's case for free, it's millions of legal man hours. How about let's direct all that time and energy into something productive, like for Native Americans, like say a drug abuse education program, improving schools, improving crime. We as a society are so focused on the wrong things here, and so not focused on the right things.
Yeah, and to just give some context into what Steve is saying, the statistics are Native American communities have a teen suicide rate 3 times the national average.
Absolutely.
One in 10 dies of alcohol abuse-related medical complications. Mm-hmm. They have some of the worst schools and teachers in the country. Rampant poverty, rape, and drug abuse. Those are some of the actual statistics and the actual issues that the community is facing. The principal of that Red Mesa High School was quoted as saying, this issue with the Redskins, he called it a boutique issue. This is an issue that you have that you can have when you are at the top of the Native American food chain, so to speak, in terms of the community. If you're part of the well-to-do leadership, which is a very small group of people, those are the people that focus on this. The people towards the bottom and in the middle of the pack don't think about this at all. So I agree. I think Steve, you're the one who said this. It's really just it seems to me part of a disingenuous conversation. We don't look at the main issues. We take what I think is the seemingly easy issue. It's easy to look at the word redskin and say, oh, it's red and skin. It must be racist. It's owned by a white man. This is easy for me to talk about. It's not as easy to talk about the fact that the word colored is alive, or the fact that the N-word is alive in the community it was invented to oppress. That's a stickier conversation. It's much more complicated. So we go after the easy one, and I think the easy one is Redskin. So it's just amazing. I'm sorry, I know I'm rambling, but this is my last thought. It's just amazing to me to think how many people that are non-Native Americans have gotten invested in this debate and this issue. So many white people and well-to-do people, rich people, poor people, so many people. This is in the national spotlight. It's amazing for me to think that the debate about the word redskin is in the national spotlight, and we don't talk about the N-word at all. We don't talk about colored really at all. We don't talk about the real issues the Native American community is facing at all, because it's harder. The word redskin seems easy, so that's what we go for. So that's kind of my concluding thought on the issue. It's hard for me to say it's not offensive at all, but at the same time, it just blows my mind. It just blows my mind what we focus on in this country. And when you stack it up against other words, the other words are just so much worse. Mm-hmm. Let's hear what you guys think in terms of concluding thoughts. Alex, what do you have for us?
Well, I guess to sum up what kind of I've always felt about this whole debate. Look, I grew up with this team, and I'm a fan. And my heart always is that I want the name to stay because, that's what I grew up with. It's part of my identity as a person, frankly, is being a Redskins fan. But when I think about it, and I always come back to my idea of don't be a douche. And if people are saying they're offended, that probably is good enough for me to say doesn't take my life if we change it. A couple final thoughts too. One, I hope we keep the logo even if it does change the name. And I had a good. Oh, I'm glad we went through this whole thing without anyone making a hack potato joke or
thank you,
moving
guys.
the team out of Washington and changing
You just
that part
took
of the name.
my final thought.
Sorry, anyone. I'm putting this out there. Anybody who makes the potato joke at this point should just be. Can we take them out back and shoot them? Like, I'm okay with that.
I'd support that.
I believe so.
I'll support it.
That's violence, and we don't want to advocate violence except on a football
I'm okay
field.
with advocating violence against hack comedy.
Agreed.
Dane Cook, you're next.
Yay.
Steve, give me your final thoughts on this topic.
All right.
What can you say to kind of wrap up where you're coming from?
Where I'm coming from is I love the name. I've always loved the name of the football team. It's part of my identity as well. I think there's an 80-year proud tradition of use of the team name. It's intended as an honor, not as a slur. I think society is way too sensitive and is way too focused on the wrong thing here. Just from a legal perspective, I do think that it's the Redskins franchise probably has a tough road to hoe in the court system at this point, unless they get in front of the right judges, which they might. I think there's a distinct difference between Redskins and some of the other team names, the Cleveland Indians with Chief Wahoo in particular. I think it's a great thing. I think it's an honor. I think that all this is a case of political oversensitivity. That's it.
Great. And Kelly, give us the summation of your thoughts here at the end of our conversation.
I'm a Redskins fan. I'll always be a Redskins fan. I'm not personally offended by the name, but I'm also sensitive to people who feel that they are on the short side of the stick of public opinion, and that they're not going to, they're somehow not deserving of being heard. I've always felt that way. I think that it would be easy. I think it was Sean who said it would be an easy thing to it's an easy problem. If you are living in a house and a tree falls through your window and also knocks over a coffee cup, the Native Americans' window is education, it's healthcare, it's these things. The coffee cup's right there, just pick it up. It's an easy thing to solve and an easy thing to fix. I think that this is it gets probably more attention than it should, but I think it's an easy thing to correct. I just want to sum up by saying that I really appreciate the respect that all three of you guys were able to take into this conversation. I know it's a very passionate issue for a lot of people. Steve, you and I will probably never agree on 95% of questions that come up, but
Probably not.
I really like you, and I'm glad to have you as a friend. I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation, guys.
I think we're having a virtual bro hug here.
I think we're having a bro hug.
Oh, that's so nice. Everybody, all the listeners at home, their little hearts are melting
Right.
with love. I agree. I think we just had probably the most honest and fair, discussion about this that I have listened to. I've seen plenty of interviews, lots of conversations, and this honestly felt more fair to me.
No Mike Wise level meltdown about it, which is nice.
No, I'm so glad that we didn't have time to get to Mike Wise. He was waiting to come on the show today, and we just couldn't get to him.
Let's not even give him the benefit of attention at all.
Well, Steve, if he came on the show, you wouldn't be the most bald person on the show.
That's true. That's true.
He's never coming on my show. It's as simple as that. Our little show
All right,
may not be listened to a lot of people, but he's not getting our audience.
Yeah. Quick little
Agreed.
happy birthday to Beep Beep, who's a regular hamster, one of our...
happy birthday, Beep.
We all know him very well. I think he's turning 143 years old or something today.
Oh, he's young.
Yeah.
I don't know. Wow. He comes across older than that.
His lawn has been gotten off of so many times.
Well, happy birthday, Beep. Keep on beeping. That was the Hogstye. We hope you learned something. Hopefully that was a good, informative conversation for you. Get with us on our social media accounts in the meantime. We will be back next week with, drumroll please, our very own Robbie Deadeye Duncan, I believe. She'll be returning to us again. He's been out, so we'll be glad to have him back. But give us a follow on Twitter at the Hogstye, on Facebook at facebook.com/hailtothehogs. Give us a web click, please, on our website, www.thehogstye.com, and make sure you're sending feedback and questions or suggestions to our email, thehogstye@gmail.com. We'll see you on the interwebs and back here next week. Bye.
Oh, God, I can't wait for training camp to begin.